Welcome to the sixth program of On the Move. December 18th, past Friday, was the International Migration Day. Today, the rights of people on the move are possibly at more risk than ever. So it is an important time for us to talk more about solidarity and care. Today, my guest is Hannah Wallace Bowman from Doctors Without Borders team, MSF, and we will talk about search and rescue in the Mediterranean, particularly her experiences on board with rescue ships Ocean Viking and Sea-Watch 4 as part of the MSF team in assisting the crews. Welcome, Hannah. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Let me introduce you a bit more. Thank you very much. Let me introduce you a little bit. Hannah is currently Field Communications Manager on board Sea-Watch 4 as part of the MSF Search and Rescue mission to the Central Mediterranean, where she has been for the past year and a half. Prior to this, she was working on the front line of providing humanitarian response to those arriving to the island of Lesbos across the Aegean. For Hannah, how we respond to the issue of migration and the way we address the desperate reality facing those trying to reach Europe by sea is representative of the most urgent and existential challenges we face as a species, from climate change to identity politics. For her, there is no more relevant place to be. Thank you for joining me again today. So to give a brief overview of the context to our viewers, Mediterranean has been one of the deadliest external borders in the world for people seeking safety. In Europe, it made it to the headlines when 350 refugees died off the shores of the Italian island Lampedusa in 2013. For a brief time, Italian authorities led Operation Mare Nostrum, which focused on saving people at sea. Reluctance of other member states to support and the growing anti-migrant sentiments led to the termination of Mare Nostrum in October 2014. Soon after, Frontex surveillance and enforcement activities, rather than search and rescue operations by the EU, took over the control in the Mediterranean with operations Triton and Sophia, focusing on smuggling and trafficking. According to the head of Frontex in 2015, search and rescue was not in the mandate of Frontex or EU. EU's priority has been border security than saving lives, which is what we have already know by this time. To this day, as we see with the pushbacks at the Aegean, Frontex shows no accountability of its actions or its possible involvement in human rights violations. EU policies made the Mediterranean more dangerous than ever, and when hundreds of refugees continue to die at sea, NGO rescue vessels stepped up to do what the authorities should be doing. As EU struck deals with Libya, it also started to criminalize search and rescue operations activities of NGOs at seas, which have been saving people in distress and monitoring human rights violations. MSF is one of those crucial actors in search and rescue and collaborated with a number of vessels since 2015, at a time when EU is turning a blind eye, abandoning people for hours, days, weeks at sea without any assistance, and actively conspiring to push vulnerable people back to Libya, where their lives are in imminent danger. MSF is a non-profit organization. It includes thousands of health professionals, logistics and administrative staff, and provides medical assistance to people affected by conflict, epidemics, disasters, or exclusion from healthcare. So my first question for you, Hannah, on its website, MSF notes that its teams have assisted more than 450 rescue operations, and more than 80,000 people since 2015. Why is MSF at sea, and what is their role in the Central Mediterranean?
Okay, well, that's a great introduction in terms of providing some of the context to the work that we do. I think fundamentally we're there because we have to be. At the moment, what we're seeing is European states, European governments have completely abandoned those trying to seek safety by crossing the central Mediterranean by sea in incredibly flimsy rubber and wooden boats, leaving them to drown. We're there to save lives. We're doing what we can in order to mitigate this ongoing loss of life. And of course, one of the things that's very fundamental to the remit of MSF in its kind of core is this idea of being a witness to what is happening. And increasingly, and especially as humanitarian work in the central Mediterranean is obstructed, criminalized, and marginalized, it's become somewhat of a black hole in terms of information, in terms of people actually really understanding what's going on there. So on board the ships, we are there to provide medical, humanitarian care to the most vulnerable people, life-saving access to our patients, and to speak out, to speak out on behalf of and with the people that we rescue, in order that hopefully we can shed some light on what is really a devastating reality at sea.
Thank you. You have been on board with the Ocean Viking search and rescue ship for a very long time, and now with Sea-Watch 4. What is your role? What are the tasks you are supporting on board? How is the daily life on the ship for everyone on the board, basically?
Well, it's very difficult to describe daily life or a typical day at sea. It's a highly dynamic and volatile environment. It's an emergency setting, as you can imagine. My role, first and foremost, is as a communications manager to support a kind of, as we just addressed, like this idea of being able to speak the truth of what is happening. But I'm also part of the team that is deployed on board the RIBs, the fast rescue boats, and it's really a case of all hands on deck. Everybody on board the ship is trained in order to respond in the event of a mass casualty incident, so where you have multiple people potentially having gone into the water. This is something that we take very, very seriously. Everybody has to be trained, able and willing to step up, no matter what their role in a situation where we don't really know from one day to the next what it is that we're going to face. It's a very unique and challenging environment, and that much is absolutely concrete. But that's about the only thing. And of course, with COVID and how things have manifested around that over the past year, our role is continuing to evolve. There are different types of responsibilities and concerns that we might have. So it's very much about being willing to be flexible to do what's required.
What can you expand on what you mean by how things have changed with the COVID?
So one of the things that's happened is from the perspective of being at sea and trying to conduct these life-saving operations, is that COVID has been leveraged on the part of European member states to kind of repackage existing failed migratory policies. So the things that they were trying to do to us in the past to prevent us from being able to do this work haven't really changed. They've just changed the language that they use to justify why it is, for example, that we aren't able to disembark the people that we rescue in a place of safety, or why we will get held in port for an extended period of time. So what we've had to adjust to this year is these kind of periods of extended standoff, being blocked, the type of resiliency that you need to cultivate internally, but also amongst the people that you've rescued, in a situation where they've maybe been at sea for several days already by the time that you bring them on board the ship, and then you're held offshore of Europe for an extended period of time, more than a week, 10 days, 12 days, 14 days, you're trying to keep everybody as safe as possible in a situation where we're obviously working very hard to manage this pandemic, and it's you know, this extra set of challenges, obstacles, let's say, to doing work which is already very, very difficult. So yeah, I think
in terms of, like, you have started to talk about this now with this answer, but can you also, a lot of people do not know actually, I mean, most of the narratives that we hear are the EU leaders' narratives about what search and rescue does and how search and rescue operates in a criminalizing way. So from a search and rescue operations perspective, could you please tell us, how does search and rescue actually work? How, not only how do you rescue people in need, but also in a way, as much as you can, step by step, can you explain to us what happens at a search and rescue operation?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and potentially quite a long answer. I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. So we would patrol typically in international waters, in the central Mediterranean Sea. And what happens is, people depart from the Libyan coast, and they are trying to make the journey in terribly unseaworthy and flimsy vessels. We're talking about rubber dinghies with maybe 1 or 2 millimeters thickness, protecting people from the waves, from the water. If the sponson, as we call it, if one of these tubes punctures, or if the planks, the wooden planks on the bottom of the boat collapse, if there's any kind of like structural integrity, which typically there is because these boats are not fit for purpose in any way, we're in a situation of distress. So the way that we would typically be informed of whether or not there are people in distress would be via civil operated surveillance aircraft. So NGO aircraft, they're the people that would tell us that they've identified a boat in distress. And sometimes we hear through a volunteer network called Alarm Phone, whereby it's a kind of helpline, basically, for people in a situation where they're in distress. They call this number, and then the relevant authorities are informed, and then we would respond. So I think there's a notion. I think there's just I don't think there's necessarily an understanding exactly in terms of how these processes work. But we are obliged to respond in a situation of distress, as are European authorities at that stage. The difference is we're responding and they aren't. So if anybody is failing in terms of their what is required from a legal perspective, I would suggest that it's absolutely not the NGOs that are doing the work that states should be doing. It's because of their absence, it's because of their lack of coordination, it's because they don't inform. Even, for example, let's say you have a UNAV-Med, or you have a Frontex agency aerial asset having identified a distress case. They will, in my experience certainly, but they will typically not inform us that there are people in distress. So you could be in a situation whereby an aircraft, a European aircraft, is circling above people who are in danger, at imminent risk of drowning, and they will not inform the boats who are in the vicinity in order that we can respond and save people's lives. Again, if we're talking about criminality, saving lives versus the ignoring of this kind of like imminent risk, versus then also the facilitation an interception whereby those people, if they aren't assisted by us, will be taken back to Libya, which is not a place of safety, as recognized by international organizations. Even the European Commission agrees. Yet we're the bad guys, and it's a little bit, it's hypocrisy really at its most cruel, because what we see, what we experience, what we do, at the point that we are aware that there is a distress case, maybe we spot it from the bridge of the vessel with binoculars. So we have a bridge watch which will be consistently monitoring to try and find people in distress. But this is really a needle in a haystack. It's a very big sea, and we're only one ship. There are currently no search and rescue vessels in the Mediterranean at the moment. So, a lot of times it's really luck. I mean, you can try and use the resources that are available to you, in terms of information from civil society aircraft, for example. But ultimately, at the point that you've identified this situation, these people in who are in need of help, then it's all about the rescue, and this is what we train for. And the stakes are extremely high. Things can turn within the space of a couple of minutes. For example, with the wooden boats that we see, they're typically very overcrowded, and they can capsize very, very quickly indeed. People won't be wearing life jackets. It's very rare that you see people wearing life jackets. There aren't any other life-saving appliances or anything on board. People typically don't have any way of navigating where they're going. There won't be an able-bodied crew on board to help kind of take the boat where they want it to go. So at that point, it's really, the training kicks in. The ribs are launched, the small rescue boats are launched, and then you try and do what you can to, as safely as possible, evacuate the people and bring them onto the ship. And this will be the first time for a lot of people that they've been in anywhere close to a secure or stable environment for an extended period of time. And the point of them stepping onto the ship is an incredibly emotive and emotional experience. It's taken that last bit of adrenaline and that last little bit of energy, that last push to kind of get them up the ladder, and you see people, they just go down. They're praying, crying, laughing, and then exhaustion, just complete exhaustion. And during the rescue itself, if I can just go back one stage, one of the things that's really vitally important is establishing a trust, some level of trust with the people that you're trying to rescue, in a situation where many of them maybe have already been intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard. So they're quite scared about what's going to happen. They don't necessarily think that we're a humanitarian organization that are there to help them. They may have already seen people die in a shipwreck. They may have, even on that very crossing, seen people die next to them, drown, become totally dehydrated, exhausted. One of the things that we're very aware of, and during the initial triage, our medic will look for signs of fuel inhalation, which is when the gasoline in the tanks will mix together with salt water in the bottom of the boat, and it creates a kind of toxic, corrosive mix when it comes into contact with human skin. So you have this kind of exposure to fuel that you're very worried about in terms of what's going on with the physical body, but then the inhalation of the fuel can make people start to panic, have them act in a way which is quite erratic. And so not only are you trying to establish this sense of trust and to identify kind of what other factors you need to be aware of that could complicate a situation which is already very, very fragile, but then you're trying to you really just have to be as clear as possible, as calm as possible. Keep your eyes on me. You're safe. You may not share the language, but you can share that moment to be like, I'm here. We're here with you. You're going to be all right. And there is nothing like being in the darkness and hearing the sound of a baby crying, but you can't see any lights. There's nothing else around. Maybe in the distance there's the kind of flare of one of the oil platforms, which kind of adds to this sense of dystopic reality. But this position where you've got this audio of vulnerability, and now this is the moment. This is like we have to make sure that we get these people out alive. You carry that. You really carry that with you. And this is I think when it becomes like almost personally very, and I don't typically talk from this perspective, but it becomes personally quite hurtful. I joined MSF for a reason. And if I were doing this kind of work somewhere else, I'm wondering whether or not the same questions would be asked of me, whether or not I was acting with criminal intent, or not being respectful of the law, or whatever. When objectively speaking, we are doing what we can to prevent people from drowning. We are explicit in what we do. We are transparent about what we do. At every step of the way, our operations are open to scrutiny. We're always very, very clear about how we've learned about a distress case and how we've responded to it. So we're wide open. And the suggestion that it's anything to the contrary of that, it's difficult to deal with.
The issue of accountability and transparency is the problem that we have with the EU agencies rather than the NGOs that are working at sea. I mean, the lack of coordination they have with the search and rescue vessels doesn't seem to happen with regards to the Libyan authorities, for example. They seem to be highly coordinated with them. So in that sense, the lack of transparency and protective measures is actually the EU to be blamed in that sense, I think. And on that account, in different accounts over the years, we hear, as you have now very, very elegantly and very, I don't know how to say it, but very strongly actually explained, they go through these perilous journeys through Africa to reach Libya. And then they face horrendous conditions in Libya. And it is an issue that I would like to discuss in the future with another someone from MSF, hopefully. And they stay in Libya for a very long time just to be able to reach to Europe in those horrendous conditions. They come from all around Africa and even sometimes Afghanistan and Syria through Libya to the Mediterranean. And most of the time in Europe, these are merely represented as statistics. For example, for this year, it says 83,000 sea arrivals to Italy, Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and Malta, and estimated dead and missing 1,000 people in 2020. And these numbers get constantly updated by UNHCR and IOM. But of course, there's a different side of this story, the human side of the story, which you are face to face every day on board. Can you tell us, who are these people that the search and rescue operations are trying to help? What are their stories? And why are they left with no other choice other than taking these journeys on sea?
So it's interesting that it's gotten to the point that we actually have to remind ourselves of the human side of the story. When, from where I'm standing and as I perceive it, that's the only story that there is. I think there's a widespread misconception that people make a choice. Like this is something that they'll opt into over a breakfast dinner table conversation. Oh, well, wouldn't it be nice if we went to Europe via the central Mediterranean, and off we go. And just to give you an example, from the last rotation, we had many unaccompanied minors. And this is an expression we don't really like to use so much within MSF, because again, it's quite disjointing from the reality. Actually, what we're talking about is that they're children, young people under the age of 18, traveling on their own. They're making this journey without their parents. Some of the kids that we met on the last mission had left their homes when they were 10 or 11 years old. By the time that we met them, they were around 13, 14. So they spent an extended period of time in Libya or on the journey before the moment that we rescued them. And one of the young boys actually was somebody who'd suffered, he was just 17, and he'd suffered extensive fuel burns during his journey. He collapsed onto the floor of the rubber boat, and his friends were unable to revive him. So he was covered in burns and he had to be medically evacuated. The stakes are high. These people know that it's dangerous. They're terrified. They're terrified. Some people have tried to make the crossing before, more than once. Some people even describe having been in a situation where they've seen aircraft circling overhead. Days have passed. People next to them have died. And then they've been taken back to Libya, and the cycle repeats. So then it begs the question, okay, so if you know it's so dangerous, if you've seen people perish during the attempt to make it across the sea, why would you do it? Why would you do it again? Because there is no other choice. It's a common refrain to the point that it starts to roll off the tongue, but really it's so deeply concerning when you hear a 13, 14-year-old kid tell you, I would rather die than stay another day in Libya. Ostensibly their whole life ahead of them, but they felt like there's absolutely nothing to live for. There's no other way out. For people who crossed into Libya via the Sahara, for example, the notion that you could then just retrace your steps is unthinkable for most people, in terms of how quickly it would be that they were assimilated back into this cycle of abuse and violence and extortion. So this is what happens to people. They get stuck in Libya in a situation where there is no way out. They're consistently paying for their safety. So they will tell us, for example, they could be walking down the street, they could be going to the market, and then they find themselves being hauled into the back of the car and then trapped in some place of captivity, formal, informal. And in order to secure their release, they need to pay. And a lot of people don't have money. They're not able to work, or they lost their jobs while they were in Libya. If they have been able to work previously, the migrant population was able to sustain in Libya, but that has changed, which is why we've seen such a shift in terms of the people that are trying to make the crossing. But they will describe, for example, being on the phone to loved ones while they're being tortured, while they're having melted plastic poured onto their body, in order that the person on the other end of their phone, their mother, their brother, their father, will hear them cry, will hear their pain. And at some point, the money will come or it won't. And if it doesn't, they stay where they are. So we've met people who were in these kind of loops for years and years. We've seen the scars on their bodies. We've heard their stories, tales of people being held imprisoned behind walls while they work on construction work, for example, which doesn't sound that bad. So they're working on doing some construction work. Okay, fine. The caveat to this being, if they make a sound while they go about their work. If they laugh or if they shout out or cry, they will be shot. And that this is the reality that we're asking people to adjust to, that we turn to these statistics of a problem to be managed. In a situation where you're talking to a guy who's had to pay for the freedom of his 2-year-old child who was born into captivity, when you're talking to women who have seen their children buried in the sand in front of them, they've been systematically abused, violated, and we need to manage this problem. Yes, we do need to manage this problem, but the problem is not in terms of these, quite frankly, pretty low numbers of people who are trying to make the journey. If there were a concerted effort to support a humane and sustainable approach to migration, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The issue is it's leveraged in a way that it becomes a very polarizing discussion. And it's no longer about, of course, you're going to save the life of somebody who's trying to escape a situation like the situation that they face in Libya. It becomes, well, we can't take them all. And actually, there's such a disconnect between what's actually happening, what our responsibilities actually should be, and the response that is manifesting on the side of the Europeans at the moment.
On the stories of the people that you've met on board, has there been any specific stories, individual narratives that stuck with you? I'm sure there are thousands of them, in a sense, because in my experience, they merge into one another, and then there are these very, one-to-one narratives that I remember as well. So, but can we ask for one of them at least?
Oh, it's really difficult because there are so many people that have changed my perspective and have touched me very, very deeply. And it is, I think, for me, always it's always like the teenagers, like the kids that you can have a joke around with, that you can laugh with, that they come with the expectation of a future, and a sense that fundamentally, despite everything they've been through, the world is actually quite a good place. And I remember this was probably, I think, one of my first rotations ever with the Ocean Viking, and I met this kid. He was 16, I think, and he was telling me his story about kind of what he'd been through and having lost his parents. And there was no sense of drama or occasion to what he was saying. It was just like, oh, and then, and then this happened, and then I was in this camp, and then my sister was raped, and da 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 da. And I'm like, okay, and this is devastating, and I don't even know how to process what it is that you're saying. But the thing that really struck me, I think, more than anything else, was the idea that what he wanted to do is he wanted to, if he had the chance now, learn how to do what we did. He wanted to be a doctor, or he wanted to rescue people, or he wanted to help people, and he wanted to go back to Sudan. He was from Sudan. He wanted to go back to Sudan and be part of, like, trying to make things work, make the world a better place, basically. And he just kept on saying, and thank you to Europe, and thank you, Europe, and like these hopes and dreams and ideas that, as long as you care and you work hard, it will come right in the end. And I was like, yeah, okay. And I really wanted to bolster his enthusiasm. And then in my head, what I'm actually thinking is there's a really high chance that things aren't going to go your way. And there's such a contrast and a contradiction between the conversations that I have on deck, the people that I meet, the stories that I hear, the humanity of the situation, versus within a few minutes me stepping inside, maybe fielding an interview with a Good Morning television show, whatever, in the UK, and immediately the question is, well, you know, you're making people come, and we can't take them all, and I'm just like, you're completely missing the point of what's happening here, and I don't know how to help you understand apart from can I take you with you? Can I take you with me? Can I have you sit with these people, listen to their stories? Because I think maybe that's the key to this here. I think probably, you know, we aren't all lost in terms of humanity. I think we do. I think people really do care. I think if people understood, if they were given the tools to understand the situation, they would be outraged, and they would care very deeply about what's happening. But of course, they're not. You know, it's not necessarily in the interest of the powers that be to change the perception as is, as it's being presented.
In one of the interviews, it might be one of those talks that Pia Klempt was asked to give, and Pia just said like that. I think she also heard from another activist that she's been working with, that if you hear these stories and if you understand them, you act. If you haven't act, you haven't understood ever. So it's this parallels with what you're saying, is that we are telling these narratives from Lesbos to the Mediterranean to Venezuela, of all the narratives of people on the move. And I also don't know like what it will take for them to understand. I mean, I'm not asking this necessarily for a question for you at the moment, but we've been telling these stories every day, with people who are the rights holders themselves, we who are trying to be in solidarity with them. But I have no idea what it will take for people to understand in larger numbers of the challenging environment that we're living in. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think if we had the answer to that, we'd be in a very different place to the one that we are right now. But I do think it is important, again, to go back to this idea of the illusion versus the reality, and to kind of cut through some of the empty rhetoric that we're hearing on the part of European governments, of European states. And of course, in a situation, I mean, you asked the question, what will it take? Well, what we see is at the moment of a shipwreck, at the moment that there's an incident where there is a mass loss of life, as we saw, for example, in the situation with the open arms recently, and the baby Yusuf who died just 6 months old. There was this kind of outpouring of indignation on the part of European actors. And even Frontex declared that, you know, they had been happy to provide the information to the NGOs, and this was a case of collaborating with all operational actors. Whereas the reality is these shipwrecks are absolutely a product of a situation that has been created by European governments and European states. So this is not it's very concerning the way in which this is naturalized or depoliticized.
Yeah.
And there is something, you know, and the hand wringing that goes on. Well, if only there was something we could do. Well, if there is absolutely something that can be done to address the issue of safe and legal routes, in order that people are not forced into a situation where this is the only choice that they had. And it's not, you know, it's not rocket science. So I think that's something to be. I think that's something that's actually very disorienting. And there's, you know, this, on the one hand, the talk of European values and European solidarity, and on the other, you know, a complete relinquishing of responsibility and undermining systematically of solidarity, and then a criminalization of the people who actually support and embody those values as in some way being deviant, or problematic. So it's a kind of nonsense paradigm that's been established.
Yeah. I mean, now actually you moved on to my next question, so I want to jump in there and ask and skip some of the things that I wanted to say to save time. But both the ships that you were on board with, Ocean Viking and Sea Watch, are currently blocked, right? And they are now unable to leave to continue their operations. And Sea Watch was, as far as I know, impounded in September. And the charges by Italian authorities are completely nonsense in my perspective. Can you please tell us, like, I mean, you've already mentioned and provided the general framework, but can you flesh out what are these harassments by the authorities towards the NGO ships to deliberately prevent them from carrying out their search and rescue operations?
Yeah, so they're very canny and they're very clever because, as I say, you know, they aren't adopting the Salvini approach, which is to declare his intention and his bias and to stand against what it is that we're trying to do in terms of saving lives. Instead, it's either wrapped up in the rhetoric of public health concern, or, and what we're seeing consistently at the moment, is the port state control, which is designed to support the safety of navigation at sea and is a legitimate maritime procedure and process, being instrumentalized in order to prevent rescue boats from being able to sail. So within a few hours of us arriving to the port in Palermo, we had the Italian Coast Guard on board the ship, and they identified 22 deficiencies, so-called, many of which would absolutely not warrant a ship not being allowed to sail, like tiny details. And there are others, the ones that, and these have all been resolved at this time. Usually it'd be presented to the ship owner as something that needs to be resolved. Okay, well, just keep an eye on that kind of thing. Rather than, okay, no, do you know what? You're not going anywhere. That's it. Your ship's being impounded. So these smaller points have all been resolved, and then what we've got outstanding are politically motivated, and clearly so. And this is much more difficult, of course, to address. But I think I come back to my previous thread here, is the total contradiction between the idea that the authorities are concerned about our well-being, or the well-being of the people that we're trying to rescue, and being concerned with things like there are too many life jackets on board was one of their concerns. But for example, with the sanitation on board is not necessarily that if you had this many passengers. And this is ridiculous. We're not talking about passengers, because it's not a cruise ship. We're in a situation where we are in the central Mediterranean trying to save lives because European states are failing to do so. We rescue people. We request a place of safety because a rescue is not complete until people are disembarked in a place of safety. Then they hold us at sea for days and days, sometimes weeks at a time, pushing everybody to the limit of their psychological and physical capacity. And then finally, when we are allowed to disembark, after, in this case, already having then been quarantined for more than 2 weeks, despite all of the crew testing negative for COVID-19 twice, and despite holding the people that we've rescued offshore in quarantine ferries for extended period of time, where we are very unclear as to how much support they get in terms of medical expertise, being able to contact families and so on. You may remember that a young boy recently was evacuated and subsequently died after being held on a quarantine ship in Sicily. Now you're so worried that there might not be adequate sewage filtration facilities in the event that we have this many people on board, that you will prevent us from sailing. If you're concerned about it, then support us in rectifying the issue, or cease and desist. But it's the way it is all wrapped up in this kind of idea that, you know, well, this is about safety, this is about health, this is about, no, it's not about any of those things. This is politically motivated. So let's be frank about that.
Yeah. Finally, I want to ask you again a follow-up, because these criminalization processes obviously are serious threats to people in solidarity. Some even risk imprisonment. But at the end of the day, they have the criminalization of search and rescue, prevention of search vessels being at sea, has far more dangerous consequences for people on the move. Can you tell us, like, how criminalization of solidarity at this moment? Because as far as you said, at the moment there are no search and rescue vessels at the Mediterranean right now. What does this mean for people in need, and maybe in a way as your last words to close the program?
So I mean, the outcome of this kind of concerted approach to undermine solidarity is leaving people to die. It's leaving people to drown, to sink beneath the waves that people will never know even whether or not they existed. From our perspective, of course, there will be families who mourn their loss, but we see that there's increasingly a phenomenon of what the IOM would refer to as ghost boats. So boats that depart from Libya and they never arrive, and nobody knows what happens to them. And that's a devastated family who will never be able to rest in the knowledge of what happened to the people that they care about. And I actually think that there's something that I find that very, 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 very difficult to deal with, and it's not something that we speak about all too often. Anyway, sorry, I digress, because this is an issue, as I think you can tell, that I feel very passionate about. This year, I think around 12,000 people have been intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard and pushed back. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of people being left to sink beneath the waves, in a situation where the work that we do is presented as being the problem. The stakes really couldn't be higher. I will continue to fight for a belief in a humanity that stands for the values that it pertains to hold dear. And if I didn't believe that, there was a possibility that at some point we're going to realize that the way that we're addressing the situation of how people move is profoundly damaging, then I wouldn't be able to keep going. I wouldn't be able to get up in the morning and keep up the fight.
Thank you very much. I don't even know what else to add or say. I really appreciate your input and your words and the feelings that you have presented to us here. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think solidarity will win, and we'll keep the good fight, and hopefully I'll meet you somewhere close to the sea in the line of work we do someday soon. Thank you very much again for joining today, and hopefully we'll see Sea-Watch 4 on sea in the Mediterranean quite soon, and we'll hear from you from the ship. Thank you very much.
Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for watching us. In 2 weeks, we'll see you again on the move with another story. Thank you very much.
Merci SOS, merci. Come here.